Good afternoon, and welcome to our keynote that we've been anticipating through the whole day today. It's an honor and my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Joanna Bourke, who is a Professor Emerita of History at Birbeko, University of London. She's also a Professor Emerita of Rhetoric at Gresham College and a Fellow of the British Academy and OBE. Joanna has won quite a lot of prizes as the author. We are all aware of her books. I just list some of them. In 22, Written books published Disgrace, Global Reflections on Sexual Violence, and Oxford University Press published Birbeko, 200 Years of Radical Education for Working People. There's another book, Evil Women, who is now in the press, and also with a written book. Joanna's books have been translated in several languages: Chinese, Russian, Spanish, Catalan, Italian, Portuguese, Czech, Turkish, Korean, and Greek, among the others. Joanna is currently working on a book on wine and women, that is the female cultures of wine drinking. And she welcomes your anecdotes, by the way, so if you want to share anything. Today, Joanna is giving a talk titled, as you see on the slide, The Things They Do for Love, Female Violence and Psychiatry in the UK, US, and Canada. Joanna, the floor is all yours.
Thanks so much. It's really wonderful being here. This is my first time, and it's such a beautiful, beautiful city. But I've particularly been enjoying this conference. The variety of topics are all around, of course, family violence, but also just the thoughtfulness with which people are adopting and approaching these topics. So I've already learned a lot. So I'm really looking forward to tomorrow as well. I really have to thank the organizers, Marianna, Skaitė, who have just been unbelievable in all this process. So thank you very much, and thanks everyone for coming. I'm actually going to talk about the book that is coming out next year. It's coming out, it is next year. It's coming out 1st of March, which is a book called 5 Evil Women. And what I do in this book is I study 5 of the most reviled women in the modern Anglophone world. Myra Hindley, Rosemary West, Aileen Wuornos, Carla Hobolka, and Carla Faye Tucker. I don't only look at them. The 5 main chapters are structured around them. There's another 3 people I look at, but those are the main women I'm focusing on. And their crimes, or I better say in advance, it's going to be quite tough, some of this stuff, so I won't be at all offended if you want to take a break. Just walk out and stay out or come back. But their crimes of sexual abuse, torture, and murder attracted international notoriety and revulsion. From the very moment their offences came to public attention, and for decades afterwards, each has been branded icons of evil. And in the book, I argue that the term evil itself, obviously in inverted commas, is used primarily to conceal the absence of any explanatory framework for their atrocious deeds. Now, in today's talk, I'm only going to be looking at 3 of those women, Hindley, West, Homolka, to help us trace what I see as shifting psychiatric ideas about women who commit acts of exceptional violence. The book, of course, looks at other discourses as well, theological, sociological, philosophical, tabloid ones, for example. But today, my focus is going to be on medical professionals, but I'm more than happy to talk about those other discourses. Now, it's important, I think, to start by saying that the crimes committed by these women are, of course, not typical. There is a large and actually very sophisticated literature about the pathologization of criminal women. Women who kill their children or lovers, women who steal from shops or employers, women who sell their bodies, women who create mischief in public streets and bars. What I think sets the women I'm looking at apart is that they were regarded at the time and today as particularly monstrous, precisely because of the lack of any clear discourse to explain their actions. The three women I look at today can also, I think, be used helpfully to see first how psychiatric models that are applied to violent women differ from those that are applied to violent men. And second, they help us trace through changes in psychiatric models for sexual or for female violence, including female sexual violence committed by women. I'm going to start by Myra Hindley. Now, let me just say as a pause here that the women I'm looking at have a very national focus. So, for example, when I'm talking to people in Britain, everyone knows Myra Hindley, everyone knows Rose West, but they don't know Homolka, for example, the Canadian. Everyone in Canada knows Homolka. So I think one of the things, and so on and so forth. So one of the things I'm also looking at is this sort of the national identities and the way these women are fitting into very national discourses as opposed to international. Okay, Myra Hindley, for those of you who don't know, she's probably the most well-known of all the women I talk about. Between 1963 and 1965, Ian Brady, Myra Hindley, who lived together in a working-class area of Manchester, tortured and murdered 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey, 12-year-old John Kilbride, 12-year-old Keith Bennett, 16-year-old Pauline Reed, and 17-year-old Edward Edwards. They were tried in 1966, and since only a few months before this trial, the Murder Abolition of the Death Penalty Act was passed. They couldn't be sentenced to death, they were sentenced to life imprisonment. And Hindley was to remain in prison for 36 years until she died in 2002. Now, compared to the other women I'm going to be talking about, there was only one psychiatric narrative circulating around Hindley. And surprisingly, perhaps, that narrative was degeneration. Note, this is the 60s, 1960s. Crucially, the stigma of degeneration was believed to be etched on the criminal body. As with news reportage, psychiatric attention at the time focused on the police mugshot. In other words, monstrosity could be seen, and in ways that were not only gendered, but also very strongly classed. Now, we've heard a lot here today about Lombroso. In the British context, as well as in the European context, he's totally, this is the 19th century, he's totally discredited. He's unimportant. He's just not thought about. Which is why it's interesting that in the 1960s, suddenly, when they're faced with Myra Hindley, suddenly, out of nowhere, quite literally out of nowhere, he pops up. It's the only psychiatric discourse at the time around this woman. In 1893, everyone here knows Lombroso and his assistant, Ferrero, published La Donna Delinquente. It was translated into English 2 years later. Over a quarter of this massive text was dedicated to proving that criminal women possess the stigma of degeneration. Lombroso coined the concept of double deviance. In other words, as they put it, the born female criminal is doubly exceptional, first as a woman, then as a criminal. And this is what makes her a true monster. And I emphasize this because anyone who knows the literature on really bad women knows that two feminists in the 1990s coined the term double deviance. It's actually 1893. Crucially, in this discourse, the degeneration of evil women was plain to see. According to them, we've heard something about this earlier today, the very faces of monstrous women were deeply lined and twisted, giving them the appearance of a satanic leer, like witches, as they wrote. Their hair was darker than that of honest women, a nod to racialized sciences. It was much more profuse in quantity, read animalistic, and was often prematurely grey on account of their agitated life, the fear of old crones, postmenopausal women. They described criminal women as short, overweight, more likely, if you can look at the women next to you, to have asymmetrical skulls, jutting brows, enormous lower jaws, anomalous ears, and crooked noses, degenerates in short. And they conceded that a ray of beauty might be detected in some of these women, but even in these cases, the women's appearance was, in their words, more virile, meaning masculine, more virile than feminine, which was repulsive. Now, what explains the corruption at the heart of these female criminals? Well, they believed that criminal women were atavistic, throwbacks to more primitive life forms. This was why they resembled savages. Second, they were not real women. They possessed masculine qualities. And the most threatening of these qualities, no surprise here, were sexual, or what they called a exaggerated eroticism, which is abnormal in most women. And this sexual perversion often included a taste for lesbianism. Finally, they argue, like animals, like primitives, like children, they are less sensitive to pain than men. And, quote, because compassion is an effect of sensitivity, if one is lacking, the other will too. In normal women, this defect is neutralized by their piety, maternity, sexual coldness, physical weakness, and undeveloped intellect. In female-born criminals, however, a morbid activity of the psychical centers intensifies their bad qualities, compelling these women to seek relief in evil deeds. They were all the more dangerous when piety and maternal feelings were replaced by cold passions and intense eroticism, muscular strength, and superior intelligence. And this will come up a number of times, superior intelligence of these women being a bad thing. When this happens, they wrote, the innocuous semi-criminal who is always present in the normal woman is transformed into a born criminal more terrible than any male counterpart. And in such circumstances, a woman's evil tendencies cannot be restrained. She becomes a true monster. Now, although, as I said, Lombroso's ideas were published 6 decades before Hindley's trials and had been totally discredited for 6 decades, they were adopted by medical professionals, particularly psychiatrists, in the 1960s, keen to draw a link between her appearance and her actions. In addition to noting that she bore all the facial stigma of degeneracy, they noted that she spurned motherhood, was sexually voracious, and there were hints of lesbianism. It was only from the mid-1980s onwards that the language shifted. In other words, it's not until 1980s that the language is shifting from the stigma of degeneration a la Lombroso to the stigma of depravity, which in its post-1980s psychiatric labeling, as we'll see shortly, meant pedophilia and sadism. Now, at the time of the trial, and for more than a decade afterwards, however, aside from the Lombroso-type discourse, there was actually relatively little medical or psychiatric interest in Hindley. Hindley's sanity, in fact, was what caused the most anxiety. People were accustomed to judging violent women according to diagnostic categories such as moral insanity, hysteria, and for women who killed their infants, postpartum psychosis. Even today, a very much higher percentage of violent women in comparison to violent men enters psychiatric pleas. In contrast, much of the loathing towards Hindley at the time was paradoxically based on a deep-seated fear that she was normal. She was psychiatrically normal. This is certainly not the case with Brady. His actions were very easy to place within the usual frames of meaning associated with violent men. Not only did he torture animals as a child, he was violent towards his schoolmate, he spent much of his childhood in Borstalls, had a long history of criminal violence, but he was also mentally unstable and later in his life was diagnosed with schizophrenia and acute paranoia. As people as different as David Smith's, Hindley's brother-in-law and witness to one of the murders, and the mother of Leslie, Anne Downey, Woodard on 2 separate occasions, she is the worst. At least Brady had the decency to go mad. In contrast, Hindley was not suffering from any recognizable psychiatric illness. As one put it in 1967, Hindley is sane. Or as Brady himself put it in the same date, 1967, that is just before he was diagnosed with schizophrenia, I have to say, the trick cyclists, which is their term for psychiatrists. I love that term, trick cyclists. The trick cyclists should fuck off. The 2 of us is saner than the lot of you put together. Not only was there no suggestion of mental illness in Hindley, but there were also no claims of paedophilia. At the time of her trial, the media-inspired panics over women's involvement in child sexual abuse was not part of popular consciousness. This wouldn't happen until the 1980s. The shift, though, from degeneration to psychiatric depravity was most starkly revealed during the controversy about the Sensation exhibition at the Royal Academy of Arts in 1997, when Marcus Harvey's massive painting entitled Myra, this is it here, generated frenzied discussions about Hindley as a paedophile. The painting had been done, by the way, using the hand casts of 2 young children. The self-same image that had been used to reveal Hindley's degeneration was now the image that was revealing her pedophilic identity. Now, Hindley's treatment by the psychiatrists in the late 1960s to the 1990s, or very late 1980s, is in strong contrast to this next woman, Rosemary West, when the crimes of her and her husband, Frederick West, came to light in the 1990s. Basically, for those who don't know the story, between 1991 and 1987, Fred and Rose West sexually assaulted, tortured and killed an unknown number of girls and women. Fred West committed suicide in prison, and in November 1995, Rose was found guilty of killing 10 girls and young women. There were a lot more than 10, but she was convicted of 10. These were stepdaughter Charmaine West, age 8, Linda Goff, 19, Carol Ann Cooper, 15, Lucy Partington, 21, Therese Siglahala, 21, Shirley Hubart, 15, Joanna Mott, 18, Shirley Robinson, 18, Alison Chambers, 16, and Rose West's own daughter, Heather West, 16. And as I say, there were certainly a lot of other victims, some of whom we know survived the torture, others we know did not. She was sentenced to life in prison and is still alive. And about the question about female voices, I have a lot of female voices in the book version, but Rose West has refused to talk to anyone for the last 35 years, including me. Now, how did medical professionals explain Rose West's extreme viciousness? Now, her crimes, just to remind us, were committed 3 decades after those of Myra Hindley. But it's remarkable how they elicit similar sociological anxieties. And these are around the effects of pornography, violence in the mass media, the permissive society more generally, and the disruption of traditional gender norms. But the commentary from psychiatrists were very, very different. Rose West's early childhood and entire life had been one of exceptional abuse. Early on, it was obvious that she had learning difficulties. There was speculation that her intellectual problems might have been due to the electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, inflicted on her mentally unstable mother throughout the pregnancy. Fellow students used to call her Dozy Rosie. Her father, William Letts, was mentally ill. He had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia since a young man, and he ruled over his family with a rod of steel. In addition to being prone to very violent tempers and sudden mood swings, he was a bully, a Jekyll and Hyde character, and he's also a sexual sadist. He raped his daughter throughout her childhood. As a child, she was also raped twice by strangers, a secret she kept to herself. By the age of 14, she was selling sex. She was clearly disturbed, rocking herself to sleep every night. When Rose West encountered Fred, who was, by the way, known as Weird Freddy, she believed that she had met, in her words, the prince, who would take me away from my family. She turned 15 the day before they met. He was 27 years old. Like Rose, Fred had also been raised in a highly abusive, sex-obsessed home. From the age of 12, he was having sex with his mother. He was probably being sexually abused by his father, who introduced him to bestiality. When Rose fell in love with him, she was unaware that he was already a rapist and had committed at least 2 murders, namely the murder of his children's nanny, Annie McFall, who had been pregnant with his child at the time, and his first wife, Rena. Now, psychiatrists in the 1990s immediately latched on to the fact that surviving such a painful childhood and youth was fertile grounds for a diagnosis they had just invented: attachment disorders. The theoretical foundation, of course, for these disorders was the British psychiatrist and psychoanalyst John Bowlby, specifically his 3 volumes entitled Attachment and Loss. For those of you who don't know it, according to Bowlby, interpersonal relationships in childhood enabled individuals to develop knowledge about themselves and other people. If denied love, infants become enraged and or withdrawn, which affect their relationships for all of their life. The implication is that the abusive early life experiences, which West undoubtedly experienced, caused her to develop insecure attachments and personality disorders, both of which were risk factors for future maladjustment and extreme aggression. So what's important here is that rather than attachment disorders generating sympathy for women who acted violently, even perhaps acting as mitigating circumstances, West's childhood experiences served to make her more dangerous. Her history was even linked to a narrative of criminality that was predetermined. So she was predetermined even before birth, when she was in the womb to become this person. Psychiatrists trotted out the usual arguments about degeneration. This wasn't an important bit, but it did appear some occasionally. She was dead-eyed. Her face was the color of yesterday's porridge. She was some kind of Neanderthal mutant, savage throwback to an earlier age. However, 2 new themes became really important. The clinical as opposed to sociological, and we can talk about that if you want, pathologies of sexual sadism and pedophilia. Even though Hindley had been present when at least one of her victims was sexually tortured, so it's Hindley, she had been present when at least one was sexually tortured, there was little suggestion at the time that Hindley engaged in those acts for her own personal sexual arousal. This was not the case with Rose West. When West was committing her offenses, the concept of sexual sadism was already a century old, and with the exception of female Nazi guards, was not generally applied to women. Sadism, the father of all this, sadism, according to Richard von Krafft-Ebing in Psychopathia Sexualis, was an excess of normal male sexuality. As he put it, sadism is nothing more than an excessive and monstrous pathological intensification of phenomenon which accompanies the psychical vita sexualis, particularly in males. For Krafft-Ebing, physiological conditions explained why monstrous sadistic acts are more common in men than in women. He explained, in the intercourse of the sexes, the active or aggressive role belongs to man. Woman remains passive, defensive. It affords man great pleasure to win a woman, to conquer her. Under normal circumstances, a man meets obstacles which it is in his part to overcome, and for which nature has given him an aggressive character. This aggressive character, however, he continued, under pathological conditions, may likewise be excessively developed and express itself in an impulse to seduce absolutely the object of desire, even to destroy or kill it. In sadistical sexual acts, according to him, this kind of normal, heteromasculine cauldron of passion overheated and exploded. Sometimes, as he put it, causing real injury, wound, or death. Now, Krafft-Ebing only devoted 2 pages to female sadists, compared to 50 to male ones. But these pages were pored over endlessly by medical professionals trying to understand Rose West's violence. Believing that female sexuality was passive and masochistic, Krafft-Ebing dismissed female sadism as a hyper-excitation of the motor sphere. And this was why female sadists were truly monstrous. Later commentators do not question this idea that female sadists are extremely rare, but they were mystified by the issue of consent in female arousal. They recognized, of course, that some women were aroused by consensual sadomasochistic practices, but they considered it exceptionally rare for a woman to become sexually aroused in the act of sexually assaulting a non-consenting person. As late as 2010, with psychoanalyst, very important psychoanalyst, Michael Stone discussed this female sadism, he had to go back to the late 16th and early 17th century to find an example. In other words, what was shocking about Rose West was her sexual arousal when committing violence. It was this aspect that was crucial in modern psychiatric definitions of sadism, sexual sadism. And, for example, it was a requirement in the revised version of the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM, in 1987, the year that Fred and Rose West raped and tortured and killed their daughter, Heather, the last known murder. The RSM-3 revised defined sexual sadism as an infliction of physical or psychological suffering on another person to achieve sexual excitement. And all the behaviors that it describes were exhibited by Fred West, and nearly all of them, not quite, nearly all of them by Rose West. Nevertheless, DSM-3R continued to assume that sexual sadists were all male. The rarity of female examples meant that psychiatric researchers always used the male pronoun he in their talks and publications. Rose West clearly a psychiatric anomaly generating astonishment, and actually that's why there's such a huge literature in medical circles. The second major difference between psychiatric commentary on West compared to Hindley, at least until the 1990s, was the appeal to pedophilia. As with nearly all the paraphilias, except sexual masochism, which is the one pedophilia, which is largely a female affliction, according to the DSM, pedophilia was also assumed to be a male pathology. DSM-4, 1994, explicitly states that people suffering from pedophilia, quote, develop complicated techniques for obtaining access to children, which may include winning the trust of the child's mother or marrying a woman with an attractive child. In other words, presuming that it's the mother who's doing the nurturing, not the abusing. The depraved human was definitely male. Now, this assumption reflected broader thinking. The idea that a woman could engage or would engage in pedophilia or rape was considered preposterous. In 1984, at the time Rose West and Fred were committing their crimes, 4 distinguished psychiatrists and sexologists categorically stated in the Journal of Sex and Marital Therapy that pedophilia either does not exist at all in women or is extremely rare. And therapist Jane Mathis went a lot further. In his quite influential book, unfortunately, called Clear Thinking About Sexual Deviations, 1972, Mathis insisted that it was unthinkable that a woman might seduce a helpless child. And he added, even if she did so, what harm could be done without a penis? Now, although Sarah Butler's book, landmark book, The Conspiracy of Silence, The Trauma of Incest, 1985, also contended that sexual abuse has a gender and it is male, by the time she was writing, this truism was being questioned. Again, this time, though, it's a sociologist rather than a psychiatrist who is crucial in publicizing the extent of female-perpetrated sexual abuse. In 1976, David Finkelhall published research revealing that 1/5 of sexually abused boys named a woman as their abuser. And convinced by such research, the British charity Kidscape hosted the first National Congress on Female Offenders 4 years later. And this was to be the start of a huge explosion of similar kinds of conferences and seminars. Turning now to the third woman in this paper, Karla Homolka. We need, of course, to return to attachment disorders, albeit again with a sadism twist. Now, people outside of Canada don't tend to know Homolka. Who knows Homolka? I know you do. Although, her name is a byword for evil in Canada. So these women are icons of evil. These are not just bad women. These are icons which that label evil is attached to them. She was born 1970, white, heterosexual, beautiful, conventionally beautiful young woman who enthusiastically participated in the sadistic killing of 3 girls and young women between 1990 and 1992. She did so alongside her husband, Paul Bernardo. Now, for psychiatrists, Bernardo is not at all difficult to explain. He was a sexual sadist in the conventional definition of the term, medical definition of the term. But clinical experts, legal authorities, media commentators struggled to fit Homolka into the explanatory frameworks they had employed for other women who had both raped and killed. The problem was that Homolka seemed to be a typical young Canadian woman. She was raised in a secure, middle-class home in Ontario. Her blonde attractiveness did not mask any atavistic instincts or propensities. Unlike Myra Hindley, there was no difficult childhood to excavate or attachment disorders, as with Rose West. Lesbianism, totally out of the frame. She loved animals and she had a very, very high IQ. How could she have participated in the rape and murder of 3 young women? Now, initially, the answer that was generally accepted by medical professionals as well as the court and media was that she was suffering from battered women syndrome. And the ideas behind this diagnosis propagated by psychologist Eleanor E. Walker's influential texts, specifically The Battered Woman, 1979, The Battered Women Syndrome, 1984, and Terrifying Love, Why Battered Women Kill and How Society Responds. Walker drew on studies performed on dogs and on rats, showing how learned helplessness developed and could result in bizarre actions. The research of psychologist Martin Seligman was particularly important for Walker. His experiments were considered unethical at the time, and they're definitely considered unethical now. He gave caged dogs electric shocks at random times and at varied intervals. Once the dogs learned that despite trying different ways to respond to the pain, the torture continued, they became compliant, passive, submissive, giving up on all attempts to escape, even when the cage doors were left open. Walker claimed that this learned helplessness was similar to the experiences of battered women. In her words, repeated batterings like electric shocks diminish the woman's motivation to respond. She becomes passive. She says, no matter what I do, I have no influence. She cannot think of alternatives. She says, I'm incapable and too stupid to learn how to change things. Walker's research was extremely powerful when she turned her attention to the minority of battered women who killed their abusers. As Walker elaborated in Terrifying Love, none of the battered women she interviewed were ruthless killers. All are victims. Now, actually, the theory is much more complicated than that, but we don't have time for that. Suffice to say that battered woman syndrome, BWS, was recognized in Canadian law and was evoked multiple times during Homolka's trial. Specifically, the coercive techniques, beatings, insults inflicted by her sadistic husband. Indeed, it was Homolka's self-diagnosis. One of the things I look at a lot in the book is the way the women themselves adopt various diagnoses, reject some, adopt others for their own means. The problem, for those of you who don't know, was that after she made a plea deal with the court, she gave evidence against her husband, which meant she only got 12 years imprisonment. She's still alive and well. Film was discovered showing her enthusiastically raping the young victims. Problem one, this did not square with she was coerced narrative of battered women syndrome. Problem two, battered women syndrome did not explain why a woman might attack another woman, another innocent woman, as opposed to their abusers. For this, a new psychiatric theory had to be developed. And this was compliant victim of a sexual sadist theory. Term coined by FBI agent Robin Roy Hazelwood, who had been assigned to the FBI's behavioral science unit, which, by the way, had no behavioral scientists in it, forensic psychiatrist Park Des and psychiatrist Jane Warren. They turned to this theory, or they developed this theory, to help understand the psychological processes of female rape murderers. To reiterate, male rape murderers were not at all problematic, and this term was not ever applied to them, at least not that I've managed to find an example of. According to its creation myth, I emphasize myth, 1990, Hazelwood attended a presentation in San Francisco where he heard about the kidnap, rape, and prolonged torture of Colleen Stan by married couple Cameron and Janice Hooker. Hazelwood was familiar with male sexual sadists like Cameron Hooker, but was bewildered about why his wife, Janice, participated in the violence. So what did they do? Hazelwood, Warren, Deese set out to interview female partners of male sexual sadists, and they called these women compliant victims. And Hazelwood explained that, the term compliant, he never meant to never meant to be used to excuse criminal behavior, but rather to make it clear that, quote, they too were victims of physical, sexual, and emotional abuse at the hands of sexual sadists. Now, for Hazelwood, Warren, and Deese, compliant victims were always gendered female. Men were never portrayed as compliant victims of sadistic female partners. All the compliant victims had been severely battered physically, emotionally, and or sexually. They turned instead to behavioral modification theories, and they hypothesized that sexual sadists used 5 consecutive steps to first trap the women, second, make them compliant so that they would abuse and torture other people, and these were the steps were identification, seduction, reshaping of sexual norms, social isolation, and punishment. And by the way, if you compare these psychiatrists' texts with the older version of Battered Women, these are more or less the same steps, except worded differently. Like battered women's syndrome and more generalized types of brainwashing, which I'm going to say more shortly, the impairment experienced by compliant victims could not be characterized as legal insanity. The women knew what they were doing, and they knew that it was very, very wrong. Rather, it was a slow process of behavioral modification that transformed these women from independent, competent women to compliant appendages of criminally active partners. And again, it's really interesting to see the way intelligent women, the intelligence of bad women become part of the diagnosis. So it's part of what makes them bad, it's because they're really intelligent. And that's one thing that stretches throughout the whole thing. These women slowly integrated, quote, the sadist sexual desires into their own behavior, leading to an erosion of self-preservation and law-abiding boundaries. She acquiesced in loathsome acts in which she was once incapable, on the grounds that she had fallen in love. It's a script. If you read, their actual words, it's a script that could have been drawn from any number of romantic novels in which weak and vulnerable women are sort of irresistibly drawn into the arms of seductive, powerful men. Dominant men demanded that their women undergo various ordeals, and female supplicants were required to give everything for the love of a man. And there's an analysis I do between romantic literature and these psychiatric texts, because they draw on similar tropes within society. Now, in order to understand why the compliant victim narrative was invented at this time of history and in North America, it's necessary to put it within the social and intellectual climate of the period. The term was really closely associated with debates at the time about brainwashing, using positive and negative reinforcement. Brainwashing came to widespread public knowledge in two contexts. First, it was important in making sense of why some American prisoners of war in Korea chose to remain with their captors rather than return to the USA. Second, our brainwashing was evoked in explaining unusual responses to crime, such as the behavior of hostages, the Stockholm Syndrome, which everyone here will know about, celebrity crimes, such as the kidnapping of Patty Hearst in 1974, was increasingly important. By the way, all these things are explicitly mentioned when they're trying to explain Homolka. Hearst was considered a classic case of coercive persuasion by prominent psychiatrists, for example, Robert J. Lifton, who gave evidence and stuff like that. A more scientific endorsement of brainwashing appeared in the third edition of the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, 1980, where it appeared under dissociative disorder, not otherwise specified, and was characterized as involving disruption in the usually integrated functions of consciousness, memory, identity, or perception of the environment. Crucially, in legal terms, the brainwashed people did not possess a guilty mind. Compliant and brainwashed people, the rare, vulnerable POWs, male POWs, and the less rare, supposedly romantically starved, served as lightning rods for more widespread anxieties about the ability of individuals from the mid-20th century onwards to assert their agency in the face of the mysterious and malign socio-political forces of neoliberalism, operating beneath the surface of society and almost impossible to detect, disallow, or fully comprehend. Now, compliant victim of a sexual sadist and brainwashing were routinely used to explain the Homolka Bernaldo dynamic. 1996, Patrick Galligan published his official report into Homolka's plea deal, conceding that Homolka might have been acting involuntarily. She was unable to extricate herself from Bernardo, who was a sexual sadist. And so he and dozens, literally dozens, of other psychiatrists quickly take this up and use it, pointing to her social isolation, exhaustion because of lack of sleep, deprivation of sleep, monopolization of perception through the exhibition of intensely possessive behavior, threats of death, and so on, and admission of drugs and things like that. Compliant victims of sexual sadists, BWS, brainwashing, and PTSD were effectively fused together in order to explain how formally competent and decent women could be stripped of agency to such an extent to engage in kidnap, torture, murder of other girls and women. The notion of compliant victim was particularly pertinent in that it not only explained, but also endorsed a fellow-centric idea of female agency, in which certain women were both victims of men and compliant with extreme male violence. In this way, female agency disappears altogether. Compliant women exist only in relation to male agency. So this, as I hope it's obvious, is a position that was diametrically opposed to that earlier evil women. Let's just, Myra Hindley, for example. Myra Hindley was given hyper agency, despite being in a de facto relationship with a diagnosed male sadist, Ian Brady. I think it's instructive to ask then what changed between the 1960s, when Hindley committed her crimes, and the 1990s, when Homolka committed hers, that was conducive to exchanging hyper-agetic evil women with non-agetic ones. Now, part of the shift, I think, is due, so the answer is it's complex. Part of the shift was due to the rise of female-orientated and often feminist-led psychology and psychiatry. In the 1960s, i.e. when Myra Hindley was being diagnosed, female psychologists were rare, particularly in this field, and most were not aligned with any of the different feminisms of their time. From the 1980s, however, feminist psychologists were making significant strides in the profession. Their research on the devastating impact of domestic violence on women's lives, as well as the gendered biases of law and the legal profession, were particularly compelling. They were able to show that the law's insistence on justice, according to the standard of the reasonable man, was just that, based on men. It didn't deal with women's lives. Between the 1960s and the 1990s, these powerful feminist critiques were crucial in explaining the shift from female hyperagency in the affluent 1960s to female constrained agency in the later decades. But this shift was also, also important were wider societal changes. After all, in the 1960s, feminists had not come to the defense of Hindley. Rather, they were silent, appalled that any woman could have acted the way she did. Indeed, the main commentary on Hindley was explicitly anti-feminist, blaming female permissiveness and the loosening of constraints on women for producing this monster. 1990s, however, the crisis of the family, fears about falling birth rates, neoliberal mantras about equality between the sexes had made non-feminist commentators aware of the need to realign societal values. Although many of these commentators believed that radical feminists had gone too far or were exaggerating the oppression of women, even they accepted that too many husbands and fathers were acting badly towards their womenfolk. However, their solution, of course, was not tackling hegemonic masculinity, but rather insisting on a return to traditional family values, which was code for reinstating female dependency on kinder men. Together with the partial acceptance in certain legal jurisdictions, particularly Canada actually, of female expert witnesses presenting accounts of the impact of violence on women's lives, the idea of limited female agency seemed increasingly convincing. On the neoliberal and neoconservative right, there was something convenient about the idea that powerful husbands and fathers could guide their weaker and more irrational female partners and relatives. At the very least, it incited paternalistic sentiment that could be harnessed for the greater good of family, community, nation. Homolka is really interesting because it provides us with an illustration of the fact that in attempting, when seeking to explain their actions, it's not necessary to defeminize women who commit horrible crimes, because femininity itself was seen as monstrous, especially when looked at through the lens of fairy tales of romance and love forever after. The anxiety that Homolka inspired is, I think, neatly summed up by a comment made by Stephen Williams, who spent a couple of years in dialogue with Homolka. In his book, he admitted that he did not believe that Homolka would ever harm anyone after being freed, noting, bizarrely, that he didn't believe this because she was slightly built. Well, she was when she killed those women anyway. He told someone, he says, "I don't fear the boogeyman or the night crawler. The people that really scare me are the people who gave her a future." In other words, the hyper-feminine Homolka was no real threat to men like Williams. He was more frightened by mental health professionals, bleeding heart liberals, and feminists. Now, we will never know exactly why extremely violent women acted the way they did. They don't know themselves. Their voices are often silenced or heard through the distorting echo of male-dominated institutions such as courtrooms, mass media, true crime reporting, and psychiatric theories, often presented, in fact, except in 2 cases that I've cited, in fact, 2 cases in the entire book, psychiatric theories presented by psychiatrists and other medical professions who never actually spoke to the women themselves. What is available, though, I think allows us to explore changes in the way their crimes have been interpreted, and they tell us a great deal about social anxieties. Just to conclude in 5 minutes, we started at 1:15, just saying that. This leaves us with just one question. And that is, well, what should we do with women and men who commit such atrocious acts? The rise of neoliberal criminology, which has a direct history, which we can talk about if you want, which has lent authority to expanded carceralism, has clearly failed. There is no evidence that people planning evil would be deterred by lengthy sentences. If the rehabilitative potential of prisons can be achieved, it at least needs the possibility of parole or not being executed, and in the current situation, that's not possible. In the book version of this talk, I explore a number of alternative responses: individual forgiveness, prison reform, restorative justice, and radical transformative politics. And I've no intention to do justice to these complex arguments here in the next 5 minutes. My book is animated by an anti-carceral impulse, but it's important to note that by removing evil women from sadistic men and toxic environments, in other words, sending them to prison, and by offering them an education, prison did rehabilitate women like Hindley and Homolka. Some forms of incarceration may be necessary to incapacitate habitually violent offenders. Despite their horrific crimes, however, none of these women, and these are icons of evil, none of these women fall into that category. Many activists also argue for a turn to rehabilitative thinking, reform of prison environments in ways that acknowledge the dignity of all humans while providing safe spaces for self-actualization, moral improvement, and restitution. Restorative justice, I have a whole section on this, is another and much more interesting and I think challenging response or approach to such people. Concept appeared in the late 1970s, but really took off in the late 1990s. It has been shown to be effective, certainly with minor crimes, but also it has been shown to be effective with serious crimes such as murder. But there are serious limits, I argue, to restorative programs. It positions violence as a violation of personal relationships, overlooking broader context by focusing on the needs of the main protagonists, primarily victims and offenders. It individualizes distress and ignores the way societal structures create the harms they claim to address. Too often, they fail to address underlying power differentials and systemic inequalities. In other words, they seek to restore the status quo rather than transform it. And so in my book, I argue for a more transformative form of justice with the ultimate aim of bringing about the abolition of prisons, not merely their reform. Crucially, transformative justice approaches seek to respond to violence in ways that do not create more violence, as is what happens throughout the prison world. It means jettisoning the neoliberal idea of violence as individual choice, which calls for individualized solutions, ranging from execution to restorative measures. So in this, of course, I'm stimulated by the critical resistance project of Angela Davis and Ruth Wilson Gilmore. In the context of the women that I talk about in my book, excarceration, which is one of their big sort of concepts, requires focusing on factors underpinning their violence, including sexual abuse, misuse of drugs and alcohol, unemployment, poverty, mental health issues, and systemic marginalization. For some women who committed terrible crimes, most notably here, Hindley and Homolka, it involves dismantling certain cultures of femininity that are as dangerous as toxic masculinity is to male-instigated violence. Transformative thinking requires us to ask how we can eradicate the causes of these violence. Now, just to conclude, when I started working on evil women, I was worried about two extremes. On the one hand, there's the risk that simply by telling their stories, I would inadvertently glamorize the killers, some of whom craved immortality. On the other hand, there was a more subtle risk of raising evil to something abstract, to be contemplated from lofty academic heights. In the end, these worries were unwarranted. None of the women I write about are heroic figures. Their life was sordid, petty, and senseless. They were all ordinary, unoriginal thinkers, lacking obvious talents or skills. None possessed any notable ideological convictions. They committed these horrible deeds for the most normal of reasons. A harrowing recapitulation of their own childhoods, romantic desperation, petty revenge, carnal indulgence, distorted mothering, or plain thoughtlessness. But as I have learnt in writing this book, it is about this need for political and moral confrontation between all too human protagonists. And my book calls for a moral engagement with people who commit violent acts. Crucially, we can remind ourselves, and this is one of the reasons why I'm a historian, that things are not always the way they are now. This is, of course, the historian's mantra. We have the power to change worlds. Telling stories about evil women and their reception, I believe, can help us think anew about their lives, their crimes, and their punishments. This will make us uncomfortable, forcing us to at least attempt to make sense of the incommensurable experiences undergone by other people. Finding dignity amongst the ugliness of violence is never easy. It can encourage different emotions, including that of radical empathy. These women's stories of extreme transgression are tragedies, and like all tragedies, take their power from the realization that it could have been otherwise for all of these women. By unraveling issues of power, responsibility, and guilt. As historians, sociologists, literary scholars, librarians, citizens, I think we can contribute to social justice. Thanks.
Thank you very much. It has been a hard talk, I have to say. I think you've raised issues that we inadvertently have been talking about and we will be talking about tomorrow. And it's not easy to sort of contemplate those issues and connect them in a meaningful manner, but also in a manner that allows us a potential to explore these issues in a framework that doesn't actually offend anyone. You know, that's the other issue. I have to say my feminism kicked in the middle, and very second wave, you know, in a way that which Hindley didn't have, you know, but Hamolka already did. And I was thinking through, you know, trying, of course, to immediately sort of rehabilitate those women and defend them, to say it's not just that they are pathologized and they're so very different from men who were by their side, you know, and all that. But then I stopped myself thinking that that's what leads us into this mess, because we still cannot, with all our experiences of academic deconstruction, with all our experiences of work with the women, as I work with survivors of extreme violence, etc., we also do exactly what those psychiatrists do. We also apply stereotypes, models that can also potentially become harmful in this context. So with this, I would like to sort of bridge the conversation to the discussion. I am sure that we'll have questions and comments, but at this stage, thank you, Joanna, very much for your thoughtful talk, and I do hope, but the book is out, that we are going to be enjoying, also reading the book, enjoying it, quote unquote. Thank you.